So I looked for a section of Miss E that I felt was really based on research or purely based on research, and I realized that there really isn't a section like that. There's not a chapter or even a short passage that's just research, which makes sense because it would almost be like reading an encyclopedia rather than a story. So um, instead of reading a passage that's just based on research, what I'm going to do is read a part of the story where Betts is given a research assignment. The situation. So Betts is the main character, and she is in high school. And in this chapter, she comes into her history classroom, and she's given this kind of unique and challenging assignment. So I'm going to read that. And the fun thing I think about this assignment, at least looking back on that time period today, is to think about all the ways that we have to research. We have Google and online encyclopedias and laptops and phones that can access all this information. So it's really easy for us to do research today. In 1967, they didn't have all those things. So the research that Betts and her classmates need to do tends to take place in the library with print sources. But I think even with the resources we have today, this assignment she gets is pretty challenging. So as I'm reading this, think about how you would approach this research assignment, how you might approach it in 1967 without all those electronic resources, but even in today's time, how you would approach this and whether it would still be a challenging assignment today. There was a buzz in the hallway even before I got to history class. Kids leaving the room were all talking to each other, but clammed up when anyone else got close or tried to start a conversation, which was the opposite of the way things usually worked. Most of the time, kids leaving a classroom scattered like crows from a gunshot, eager to find a friend who was in another room, racing to find someone that had the answers to the test in science, or pretending to ignore the boy they had just been sitting next to in class for the last 45 minutes. So before I even entered room 110, I knew something was different. The room was ringed with black and white photos. The anti-war poster still hung in the front of the room, but everything else had been taken down. The photos were at eye level, or what passed for eye level, for a group of teenagers who ranged in height from about 4 to 6 feet. Each photo showed a single person, with little else in the background. Okay, so Mr. Flynn had redecorated, but that didn't explain all the chatter in the hallway. He held up 2 fingers in the V-shaped peace sign that had been finding its way into everyone's hands over the last few years. Most people held it high, as if an end to the war were somewhere up above them, if they could only reach it. But lately I'd seen it flashed, with an aggressive jab, like a shout for peace, punctuated with an or else. A couple weeks into school, Mr. Flynn had adopted it as his signal for quiet. Those still drifting in took their seats quickly, and we all gave him our attention. Mr. Flynn was the best sort of teacher. He was able, somehow, to trick his students into being interested in whatever topic he was covering that day. He'd also managed to gain enough of our respect that we actually listened when he asked for quiet or gave us directions. Not because he'd threatened us with a trip to the office, but because most of us genuinely liked him and wanted to please him. I imagine the school administration had felt otherwise. He was in his first year at El Molino, and the haircut and shave he'd certainly gotten for his interview had long since grown out. 100 pictures, 100 Americans, the faces of American history, our history. Mr. Flynn had a way of speaking when he wanted to add dramatic effect. His sentences shortened, some not even sentences, and with pauses between each, They started to sound like lines in free verse poetry. Your assignment is simple, he continued. Identify these faces. There was a murmur in the room as we all looked around. Some were easy. Abraham Lincoln, Teddy Roosevelt, Albert Einstein. Others I was unsure of. Was that Franklin Roosevelt or Woodrow Wilson? But most, I had no idea. As I turned my head from side to side, looking at each face, I discovered something. The faces alternated, male, female, all the way around the room. 50 men, 50 women. Clearly, Mr. Flynn's list of 100 important Americans was not pulled from the pages of our history textbook. And though many of the faces staring back at me were white, some were black, Asian, Hispanic, 2 were clearly American Indian, pretty significant considering everyone sitting in the classroom looked just like me. Your task is simple, Mr. Flynn stated again, and then proceeded to explain an assignment that did not sound simple at all. As a class, you need to identify these 100 Americans. You'll also need to explain, in a sentence of 20 words or less, why each deserves a place on these walls. 20 words or less was the sort of requirement that sounded easy, but really wasn't. Your average kid would think, cool, I only have to write 100 short sentences. But how do you explain why Abraham Lincoln was important in 20 words or less? Then there were all the faces that I didn't recognize. Finding out who someone is based on their picture was like knowing someone's phone number and trying to find out their name by looking in the phone book. Were we just supposed to start flipping through encyclopedia volumes until we came across someone who looked familiar? Okay, so that's my passage on, that's his research assignment. And again, just something to think about how you would approach that if you were in Betts's class in 1967 without all the research tools that we have today, like the internet. And then how would you approach it today, even with the internet? What would be challenging about figuring out who these 100 photographs are?